Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Benefit Cost Analysis Basics. We're here to give an introduction to an important part of most applications, the BCA. This is number 5 in the 2021 webinar series for the new grant cycle. And just to point out that the next 2 sessions will cover the online system for entering your application information, and then they'll follow up. That last session will be information on grants management. And Michelle, if I could, it's good for you to move on to the next slide. I forgot to mention I should ask you to move to the next slide.
Whenever you're ready, just say slide and I'll click through them for you.
Slide. There we go. Let's head into the housekeeping slide. So we'll go to the next one, please. There we go. Wonderful. So basic housekeeping. We ask that everyone stay on mute, but we welcome questions, especially in that Q&A box. Add them to that Q&A. The team's going to interrupt us if there's a really burning question that comes to the table. And then we'll have the option of taking it, or if we know that something's coming up in the presentation, we might table it for that moment. There could be a situation where a question is going to require a bit more research. We'll take that offline, and we'll get back to you separately on those, just to make sure that we have the follow-through. But we will let you know if it's something that we can't answer right in the moment. The interactive knowledge checks, they're anonymous. We ask that you try your best, and it's really just to give us an opportunity to take a quick peek into how we're doing and what our participants know coming into this. For technical issues, as Michelle said, please send a direct chat to the host. We'll use the Q&A box for questions during this particular session. And then finally, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Jane Rockhold. I'm a hazard mitigation. Oh, I'm going to turn on my video so that we have a connection. I'm not finding my video anywhere on the screen.
We can see you, Jane.
Well, that's great. Oh, wonderful.
You did it.
I did it. I'll never be able to turn it off again. That's going to be the best part. Good morning. My name is Jane Rockhold. I'm an HMA specialist with Region 10. I focus on disaster grants, but I am thrilled to be part of this team and to be able to help present on BRIC. And I'm joined by Mark Stewart. And as soon as I figure out how to turn off my video, we'll introduce him. Take it away, Mark.
I think I hit the right button. I don't see myself yet. Anyway, I'm Mark Stewart. Again, I'm a hazard mitigation assistant specialist with FEMA Region 10. I work alongside Jane. We work on hazard mitigation grant programs. My portfolio is the state of Alaska. But I also do a lot of other things, including helping out with training. I like doing and analyzing benefit cost analyses, so I guess that's one of the reasons I'm here today, to share a little bit of information about BCAs and how to make your BCA sing in the application process. So I'm glad to be part of the team and presenting with Jane today. So take it away, Jane.
Thanks very much, Mark. So let's move to the next slide with the agenda. Perfect. Thank you. We'll be starting with an overview of the BRIC program, and then we're going to jump into the fundamentals of a benefit cost analysis. Through this, we'll take a look at the toolkit, which is the software provided to do the analysis. We'll take a look at other input bits of data that we also enter into the BCA tool. We, of course, will talk about the importance of cost effectiveness and providing the supporting documentation for those inputs that you're using within your BCA. We'll go over resources available to you for putting the BCA together. And then we'll finish up with any final questions that you might have. So let's dig into BRIC. Would you go to the next slide, please? So for those of you that have, well, Okay, just stay there. So for those of you that have been participating in webinars, this is going to be a bit of a refresher. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, that's why we wanted to provide an overview of the BRIC program. So it is the BRIC, the Building Resilient Infrastructure Communities, is a nationally competitive grant program with an annual funding cycle. It starts with a Notice of Funding Opportunity, which releases to grants.gov sometime during the summer time frame, this year on August 9th. And in it, it outlines the requirements for that year's funding cycle, and it identifies priorities for the program. Now, this year, taking a look at it, the BRIC priorities are activities that mitigate risk to public infrastructure projects, projects that mitigate risk to one or more community lifelines, projects that incorporate nature-based solutions. It has a strong emphasis that seeks to incentivize adoption and enforcement of modern building codes, really looking strongly at that. And new for BRIC fiscal year 21 is a priority to enhance climate resilience and adaptation. This whole program was authorized under the Disaster Reform Recovery Act of 2018, my favorite section, 1, 2, 3, 4. And it replaces what you may already have heard about as the PDM program, the Pre-Disaster Mitigation. One thing to note that BRIC is a pass-through and it's a reimbursement-based grant program. To be eligible for the program, the federally recognized tribes have two paths they can choose. They are able to apply as direct grant applicants or can apply as a sub-applicant through their respective state. The BRIC requires that the state or tribe to have had a major disaster declaration within the past 7 years. The tribes can either have one directly to satisfy that criteria, or they fall within a respective state that had a major disaster declaration, and that satisfies that criteria. Because of COVID-19, all states and therefore all tribes meet this criteria as of spring 2020, so everyone is actually covered in this at this point for this particular program. Next slide, please. Some key information to have for this program. Applicants must have a FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plan. This has to be in place by the application deadline and at the time of grant award. The plans required to apply for projects, as it says, it's not needed for a planning subgrant or a management cost application. Another opportunity through BRIC is if your tribe does not have a hazard mitigation plan, you can apply for funding to develop one. For more information on that, it was covered within the planning application webinar, and which should be available online soon if it hasn't already been uploaded to that site. So refer back to where you were able to access this particular webinar. More recent resources on that, we'll provide that at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. This year, there is $1 billion funding available for fiscal year 2021's Notice of Funding Opportunity and application period. Of this amount, $919 million is for national competition projects, and of that project sub-applications may be up to 50 million of a, let me try to restate that, maybe up to 50 million of a federal share each. States and tribes have set-asides and allocations, which means that a tribe may apply for up to 1 million federal share of the tribal set-aside amount for eligible activities. Well, these are such as project scoping, mitigation plans, projects, and the combination of how to apply for that funding is up to your tribal government. These allocations and set-asides do not go into the national competition. Keep in mind that the set-aside is the only place where you can submit an application for what they call capability and capacity building activities, CMCB. Those are things such as that hazard mitigation plan, project scoping, building code activities, etc. Next slide, please. Cost share is required for all sub-applications funded under this program. Generally, the cost share for this program is 75% federal or 25% non-federal. This means federal funding is available for up to 75% of eligible costs. The remaining 25% of eligible costs must be derived from non-federal sources. BRIC fiscal year 21 It revised the title that it had been using of a small impoverished community, and we're now using the term economically disadvantaged rural communities, which will eventually roll off my tongue as EDRC. EDRC, I'm going to try. In this case, the cost share shifts to 90% federal, 10% local or non-federal sources. Now, in order to meet this criteria, you must be a community of 3,000 or fewer individuals, identified by the applicant as a rural community, and you can't be in a remote area within the corporate boundaries of a larger city or jurisdictional area. And you must be considered economically disadvantaged. And economically disadvantaged, as defined in the NOFO, is 80% or less of the national per capita income. So if your community meets the EDRC cost share, it's important to request it in the application at the time that you submit. After you submit, the cost share cannot be amended and reduced to the EDRC cost share, so it's important to request that in your initial application and provide your documentation there. Next slide, please. The life cycle of a BRIC application. So the annual life cycle of BRIC begins really at the release of the NOFO this year in August of 2021. The application period opened on September 20th, and you have until January 28th, 2022 to submit your application. However, no one recommends that you wait until the last minute to hit send. It's important that you understand that once you submit your sub-applications, and applications go through a variety of steps. The grants are not awarded immediately, nor within a couple months after submittal. The selections of pre-awards, the selections or pre-award selection notice, I couldn't read my own notes, will come sometime in September of 2022. So we estimate that awards for BRIC fiscal year 2021 to be made in December of 2022, or it could be later, depending upon the level of programmatic review or EHP review that's needed. All right, so that's our overview of BRIC 2021. It was a quick one, and again, I refer you back to those webinars that have been going on throughout this season in order to really fill in some of the gaps. So let's pause for a knowledge check and see how many already have an understanding of BCA requirements as part of the application process. Remember, it's all anonymous. So we have four options. Which of the following sub-applications would require a full BCA if applying for an HMA grant? A mitigation plan. B, acquisition in the special flood hazard area, which costs less than $276,000. That's a key piece. Management costs or a seismic retrofit. And if someone could tell me when we get to share all the results.
So we have most of the responses in. Give it just another maybe 10, 15 seconds here.
I'm counting. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Well, let's assume. All right. Michelle, can you do you show me results?
So I can tell you that most of the participants said D, seismic retrofit.
Yay! And the cheering ensues. That is absolutely correct. The seismic retrofit would require the full BCA. The acquisition is going, because it costs less than $276,000, it would fall under the Precalculated Benefits memo and doesn't require a BCA. A little bit of a trick question. So now Mark is going to take us into the basics and the beginning of the benefit cost analysis. And Mark, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Jane. Hope everyone can hear me. If you can, give me a thumbs up there or a check mark like Ravi has put in the chat there. All right. Great. Thank you very much. So next slide, please. So first, going to give you a little background on benefit cost analysis before we dive into some of the details. So why do we do a benefit cost analysis? for our project. These are required for construction-related projects, and the notion is to look at the project to see if it's going to save us at least $1 in damages and lost capacity of service, lost serviceability of our community services for every dollar that we spend. So why is it required? Well, it's required by federal law, and that federal law is the Stafford Act. That's the federal law that pretty much governs all of FEMA's disaster-related and mitigation grant-related activities. It's also required in the regulation, and our regulations that deal with some of our grant programs is 44 Code of Federal Regulations, and it would be part 44 CFR is the Emergency Management Organization. I can't think off the top of my head what it is for some of the grant programs, but there's a couple of different citations in there for the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, for hazard mitigation, and so forth. And so the last piece of the benefit cost requirement is through a circular that the Office of Management and Budget has developed over the years that basically requires a project using federal grant funds has to demonstrate that it's cost effective using a benefit cost analysis. Now that circular provides sort of the framework that is used in the BCA tool that we'll be showing you here in just a little bit. Okay, so why is it a good idea? Why is it a good idea to do a benefit cost analysis for your projects? Well, it can help your community set priorities. You might be looking at multiple projects, and this might be a way to figure out how you can get the greatest impact in terms of lost reduction in damages, reduction in loss of service from your community services, and so forth, to help you determine if a project is a good investment. Example I like to use is you're probably not going to want to spend $500,000 on a project that's only going to give you a benefit of $200,000, right? You might as well burn up $300,000 in a paper bag if that was the case. And again, to help get support from your community for the project. Obviously, you want to have community support. If you're hanging out there by yourself, that's not necessarily a good thing, because once you get money for the project and you get it started, you're not going to have folks who are very happy with you. Okay, next slide, please. So what is a benefit cost analysis? It's basically a process that looks at future benefits of a mitigation project and compares it to its cost. And I mentioned that a little bit earlier here. So basically, think of a benefit in terms of, like I said earlier, a reduction of damages, a reduction in the loss of service that, say, your local fire department provides if they can't, after a disaster, can't get out and provide service and so forth. But let's think about it maybe in a little more simplistic way, and that is, quite often we just do these things in our everyday lives, figuring out whether something is worth spending money on, okay? So the example here is my gym membership worth it? So if I want to spend, you know, $60, $70 a month on a membership, how many times a month am I going to go in and use it? If you only go in once a week for an hour, you know, 4 hours, is that worth it? If you go in 5 times a week, is that worth it? Another one is, should I fix a leaky sink in my house, right? So if you have a leaky sink, then you're spending money on the water that it drips. The leaky sink also might have leaky connections down below, which means you've got water on flooring, on carpets, and and creating a big mess in your house. So, you know, what are my benefits and what are my costs? That's what the benefit cost analysis is about. Next slide, please. So costs, mitigation project costs can basically include anything it takes to implement a project. And it would be construction costs, labor and materials, equipment rental, that sort of thing. Any related costs such as title searches, if you're doing something around home acquisitions, any sort of permits you might need from your local community government. If you're doing in-water work, perhaps permits from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and that sort of thing. For the BCA, we want you to include information on future maintenance costs. Okay, that's not necessarily, we don't reimburse for maintenance costs in project applications, so leave it out there, but it is important in the benefit cost analysis because we want to know what it's going to cost to maintain the facility or the infrastructure that you're going to be building or retrofitting and that sort of thing. Engineering and design costs, you need to have, some projects you need to have an engineer and an architect to do some work for you to design the project, and you can claim those costs. Also, time either by your staff or a hired firm to manage your project. Those are all eligible costs for the project side, but also costs you're going to need to know for your benefit cost analysis. Next, please. Benefits. Basically, future costs or losses that can be avoided by completing your mitigation project. But really what we're looking at is the difference between what have the costs been to your community, or what are they projected to be in your community if you didn't have your mitigation activity in place, versus what would those costs be after you've got them in place. And so we're looking for that difference, and we call that the benefits. Okay, and the costs should be counted regardless of who pays for them, whether it's the federal government, state, tribal, or the property owner. And avoided future costs and losses can include a variety of things, including physical damage, and that includes content damage, loss of service or loss of function, injuries or deaths, and those come into play for certain hazards and project types, and I think we might touch on that briefly a little bit later. Displacement costs, and those are costs that come into play when you are you have to move your service to continue providing it. And then there's also social and environmental benefits, which I think we'll touch on here in a bit. Next slide, please. Okay, what sort of projects require a benefit cost analysis? Well, pretty much anything that revolves around construction is going to require a benefit cost analysis. The exceptions are if you're doing any sort of project scoping, that does not require benefit cost analysis, or a project where you can use what we call pre-calculated benefits. And I'll just talk about those briefly here. So some project types that meet criteria that we call a pre-calculated benefit do not require standalone BCA. And so there's pre-calculated benefits for the following project types, and I'm going to touch on a few here. Now, the pre-calculated benefits for acquisitions and elevations in the special flood hazard area, those figures that we've been using, I think, for the last 8 years were updated and effective September 30th. The others have remained the same, and there's a brand new pre-calculated benefit for hospital emergency generators. So next slide, please. So basically what it means is if your project costs come in under what the pre-calculated benefit is, you do not have to do a benefit cost analysis. It's automatically considered cost effective. So if you're doing an acquisition in the special flood hazard area, or I believe the memo on pre-calculated benefits for acquisitions and elevations provides language to the effect that if you've got an identified flood hazard area and you can demonstrate that, that also counts. So for example, if you're doing an acquisition of a home and you can cost it at less than $323,000, then it's cost effective. Elevations are now $205,000 per property. These dollar amounts went up $40,000 to $50,000 each, and for the most part was because of the time frame, the last time the dollars were set, and the increased cost of construction and construction materials now is kind of a driver on increasing those benefits. And then you see we have the new benefit for hospital generators, and there's a memo that describes that. And basically it's the project costs have to come in under a dollar figure that is either $6.95 per square foot for an urban hospital or $12.62 per square foot for a rural hospital. And again, those calculations will be building specific. Next slide, please. So one of the things that you can do, and here's an example from a recent project, is if you're in a high cost area, you can bump up the cost of these pre-calculated benefits. And let me just show you how that's done. This is an example from state of Alaska. I work with Alaska quite a bit. And so what you do this through using supporting documentation that's either published through construction. There's a number of companies that do construction cost estimating and cost analysis. One of them is RS Means. Marshall and Swift does the same thing. They publish cost documentation at least once a year. So you can use that to figure out what, if you're in a high cost area, and what that higher cost might be. So for this particular project, which is in Fort Yukon, which is up right about the Arctic Circle north of Fairbanks, there's two steps at least for Fort Yukon. And the first thing is to understand what the inflation factor is for the city or the municipality of Anchorage. And so why, Mark, are you picking Anchorage versus Fairbanks, which is much closer? Well, the second step that we're using, which is a cost model that's developed by the Alaska Department of Education, uses Anchorage as the 100% cost level for Alaska. So basically, what you can do is you inflate it for Anchorage, and then you inflate it again for the community that you live in. So you'll need to have documentation to do this, but here's an example of being able to take a pre-calculated benefit and increasing the cost to what the actual cost of construction and work in your community is. Next slide, please. Okay, we have a knowledge check here. So what is a benefit cost analysis? So go ahead, take a quick read and make your selection. And we'll give you a minute or so to do that.
Looks like we have about half the responses, so we'll give it just another second here, Mark.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so the 8 who answered are saying A.
And that would be correct. The process of quantifying the benefits of an action and comparing it to its costs. All right, next slide, please. Okay, we're going to walk through some of our what we call benefits, and that is avoided physical damages. All right, so what's included in this would be structural damage to the buildings or the infrastructure that you wish to have benefit from your mitigation activity, building contents, potentially damage to historic or cultural resources that are nearby, and then any sort of site contamination that might have resulted from a past hazard event. Next slide, please. So how do we quantify avoided physical damages? Well, there's kind of 3 ways to do that, or these are the 3 methodologies that are used. One is using hazard-specific information, or what we call modeled damages, for a few project types. For example, seismic retrofit projects. You look at the mitigation, the BCA tool, I'm sorry, looks at the type of structure and its engineering characteristics, if you will, and then looks at site-specific hazard information and does some calculations based on those 2 to sort of give you what benefits might take place given some scenarios that you plug in. You can base your benefit cost analysis on analysis using past damages, or what the tool will say is historic damages. And so here you would have to have documentation for the damages, or what's called expected or future damages. And this is where you have a subject matter expert basically looking into the future and saying, based on, scenario A and B, under scenario A, this is what we would project the damages to look like, and scenario B, this is what we would project damages to look like. And the tool uses that information, again, to calculate benefits. Next, please. Okay, I mentioned avoided loss of service, and this is basically tied to and is applicable to public facilities, for example, utilities, emergency operation facilities, police or fire stations, and infrastructure such as roads and bridges. So, for example, a generator project for a fire station can ensure that it remains operational during a storm event. And we will show you an actual benefit cost analysis for a fire station that got money for a generator. We'll show that here in a little bit. Also, benefits or avoided loss of service or loss of function could be captured a bridge retrofit. Again, it ensures the bridge remains functional during or after a hazard event. So the mitigation projects demonstrate these things. And so what we're looking at in terms of a benefit is, what are those losses we're now going to avoid, given we've put the generator at our fire station, or done a retrofit to our bridge, or we've undergrounded our electric utility, for example. Next slide, please. So how do we quantify that? I'm going to start at the bottom and work up. So the tool provides some guidance for the value of services for utilities. There's a FEMA standard value for potable water utility, wastewater utility, and for electric utilities. and it's based on per person, per day. It's a FEMA standard value, and from here on out, if you hear me talk about a FEMA standard value, it's something that we have calculated, provided in the tool. You do not have to provide any sort of documentation or justification for using a FEMA standard value. So for roads and bridges, what we're calculating, how we're calculating the value of the service that it provides is looking at the value of the detours that we would have to use if that bridge was out of service, and there's a methodology that goes through that, and it includes a number of one-way trips, the additional not only time but mileage that's required, and we use the Federal General Services Administration mileage rate, and then there's some FEMA standard values involved in that too. For critical facilities, the value of service is estimated based on the service population, and we'll show you a little bit about that as we walk through the fire station benefit cost analysis here in a little bit. And then for other buildings, you know, public, nonprofit sector buildings or other facilities that aren't mentioned below, we value the service by taking the budget of operating that facility for 1 year and dividing it by 365 to get a daily value of the service that's provided by that, that building or that facility. Next slide, please. Displacement costs. Earlier I mentioned that these are essentially the costs that are incurred when you have to move to a temporary location to operate from while the damage is repaired. And you can include rent and other monthly costs and one-time costs, you know, for moving, your utility hookup fees and that sort of thing. And for when we're talking about commercial buildings, it can include a loss of business income. Next slide, please. So what are not considered benefits? Anything that is subjective or that you can't quantify. For example, the aesthetic value of the project. Oh, it looks so nice. I don't know how you put a value on the appearance of a building, but however you calculate that, you can't use that in the benefit cost analysis. You can't include anything that's not impacted by the proposed project. In other words, you'll have to make a connection between the mitigation activity and the benefits. So for example, we have a project that I've been working on that has a warehouse with refrigerated goods. And so the purpose of the generator really is to keep the refrigeration going to maintain these perishable and valuable items during power outages. So there's a direct connection between these refrigeration materials, refrigeration units, and the mitigation activity. You have the generator to keep the power going. And then our friend Office of Management Budget Circular A94 that I mentioned before, it indicates that you can't include indirect benefits. So examples of that might be changes in your community's income, employment, and so forth, any sort of avoided criminal justice system costs for disaster-related crime. Next slide, please. Two things to be wary of or be cognizant of as you're working on your project, working on your benefit cost analysis. Two things. One is called duplication of benefits. Okay, that typically occurs when you're counting the same benefits for multiple structures, or you're using the same benefits for different projects, okay? So an example might be where, and we have one that I'll just speak about very generally, but a project where the applicant has applied for different grant funding to do some work on a structure. And so they wanted to, in the applications, they used the same benefits for each of the applications. Well, we couldn't do that, but we figured out a way to basically spread the benefits out across the entire structure. And so then we could kind of, for one grant, we knew what the benefits were because we knew where the work was taking place on the structure, and the same for the other grant program. You can only count the benefits from that part of the structure that you were mitigating, for example. So duplication of programs, excuse me, occurs when your project might fall under the authority of another federal agency, or said another way, this other federal agency may have sort of a primary responsibility for the project type. So for example, certain levee projects really are the domain of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. There are certain road projects that fall under the authority of the Federal Highways Administration, and so you'll need to do a little bit of work to determine whether the project that you're envisioning might fall under a different, the purview of another federal agency. And your state hazard mitigation officer or we can help you sort that out if you're not certain on how to figure that out. Next, please. Okay, another knowledge check. So please select the ones below that are considered benefits. So this is multiple choice. So go ahead, you've got a minute or so.
Okay, it's looking like most participants are selecting D and E.
And that would be correct. Okay, hang on here. We've got a question in the chat here.
Yeah, Mark, I can verbally raise it while you're pulling it up, if that helps.
Okay, no, I've got it right here.
Perfect, okay.
So the question is, if we include a sub-application for BCA, is there a general formula for estimating how much time a BCA will take? That way we know how much to ask for in sub-application. I assume you're talking about trying to figure out a value so you can put that into your pre-award documentation. You know, I wouldn't want to hazard a guess because depending upon the project, the complexity of the project, the type of project, depending upon how much data that each requires or expertise, you know, I wouldn't want to hazard a guess. Yeah, I just wouldn't want to do that. So, you know, you can always provide an estimate. I'll just throw out here 20 hours, and that's just real time. Oh, somebody already answered. I'm sorry. Okay. So
Mark, I'd like to jump in here a little bit as a way of looking at how to come up with an estimate for how to even think about your BCA. And I would sit down with myself and a cup of coffee, and I'd start thinking about what are the different pieces that are involved with it. And your answer of, well, it depends, is completely on the mark. So it's hard to say what it would cost if we're doing an acquisition and a demolition, or if we need to get all of these different, if we need to reach out to a city utility or get documentation for outages. So it's a matter of sitting down and looking at your project and pulling apart the different pieces of what it is that you're going to need. So you can't really come up with your total cost until you have a general idea. And you can do this in 15 minutes. Sit down, look at what you're trying to put into the tool, and think about your community and the involvement you have with different partners. Who are you going to need to ask for documentation? And if you're going to have to reach out to a city office, you might assume that it's going to take you a little while. So you might need to put in an hour or so for the back and forth emails. If you're thinking just about the labor costs involved in it, that's sitting down and looking at all the different pieces and where it touches. If you're asking for how much it costs to do one of these, it's really a matter of how much is involved in pulling it together. Some of them can be really straightforward, and you can sit down and you can pull up some of your own information, and you'll put in the appraisal information, you'll put in an estimate of how much labor you've got involved in your total project. So in order to understand how much it's going to cost to do the BCA, you have to take a few minutes and think about your project as a whole. And that really is my only advice.
Which was much better than I gave.
Well, Mark, I think it's my skill set. It's
yes,
my able to use more words to say less.
Jane and Mark, this is Brenna. Also something to consider is like if you're doing a project scoping application and you want to account for that benefit cost analysis in that project scoping application to have either the time paid for, perhaps you want to hire a consultant. If you are going to hire a consultant, I would really just recommend calling around with some basic projects to get kind of estimates that way to put in. But remember that when you submit an application, that cost is an estimate. So it can fall under that amount, but it's really important that whatever you can get, you get either a higher end or you estimate as accurately as possible, because once you estimate that set amount, so let's say you have a project scoping application that will develop a BCA and it's $200,000. If you find out a year, 2 years down the road, it's cost $250,000, we're not able to get you more money because of how it's a nationally competitive program. So it's really best to try to get as most accurate as you can. So if you are thinking of hiring a consultant, I'd really recommend calling around to get some estimates.
Thank you, Brenna. You did so much better than Mark or I. I really appreciate you stepping in. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Jane, I think it's over to you for the next segment.
All right. Well, I get to introduce the toolkit that's provided to perform the BCA analysis. So let's jump to the next slide. All right. So FEMA's created this BCA Toolkit. It's a piece of software to assist the people the applicants and sub-applicants putting together the BCA. It's the process of calculating the project's benefits and costs, and a lot of the work's been done for you. This is a Microsoft Excel-based application. It can be used on Windows, Macs. It can even be used on a tablet. For those of you using older software, this one is compatible with Office 2013 and later. So I think I still have a laptop that's got 2010 or 2011 on it, and I know I can't run it. for those of you, I'm looking at some of my notes, it's like this one comes back to our old friend, the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget Circular A94. So the BCA tool was developed in accordance with the guidelines within that OMB circular, and we look at that as a reference for how we're supposed to be gathering information. Well, after downloading, you're open to the software, you're open to Benefits Cost Calculator, and you can immediately start entering your project information and data. Mark's going to walk us through an example of the tool and how it's used in just a few minutes, but first I'm going to show you how to find it and then some of the what I think of as helpful guides. Next slide. All right. To get your copy of the tool, you go to FEMA.gov and search for the BCA tool. Just throw that into the search cell. And that website and the resource are given at the end of these slides for your reference, so you'll be able to come back to that. If you're like me and you want to have a bit of a guide for a new process, I'd select the BCA Toolkit installation instructions first. It's got a nice set of instructions there. You have the option of downloading the toolkit to your desktop, or you can use it online. And I believe you need a free Office 365 account in order to use the online version, and we have found that it works best in Firefox and Chrome. In general, once you're ready to go, you'll click the button marked BCA Toolkit version 6.0, and that'll start the process for the downloading. Now, in this same website at FEMA.gov, you're also able to download or view that BCA reference guide, and it's a supplement to the guide as well. I call these my handy reference tools. There's a glossary with abbreviations and terms that don't come up in normal language, guidance on how to gather your materials and for an application, and the types of information to collect, like facility data. So I love that guide because it kind of walks me through, here's some information that I'm going to need, and here's a resource, here's a source of where I'm going to get that information. You can't see me, but I'm pointing at things in my office, and so I like the fact that it's set up as a spreadsheet form so that I can see what I'm going to need, where I'm going to get it, and I can sit down and I can plan out how I'm going to do my data gathering. So this guide, I got to mention, the guide references an older version of the software. We're using 6.0 now, but I've still found that the general information is applicable, and it's really useful understanding some of the required entries. So again, we're using 6.0. The guide is a little behind, but it's a really good tool. Next slide, please. Great. If you have questions or problems, you scroll down to the bottom of the BCA page on FEMA.gov, and you're going to see ways to get support. The BCA helpline can assist you with questions about your project data. They are wonderful. You can also provide technical assistance if you're having problems with the software itself. You've got phone, email, staff's available to you. We remind everyone that the BCA staff can offer you guidance on using the tools or answer questions specific to the type of data you're considering. And we call them and ask them if we've got questions about a specific piece that comes through that we might not have seen before. So they can answer those questions, but they can't do the actual benefit cost analysis, nor can they review one that you've completed. This is on your own. Classroom training, well, virtual or in-person options as our current situation allows. They're offered throughout the year. Watch for those. Visit the website with a course catalog, and there's a cost schedule there. Let's move on to other BCA inputs that you're going to need to put in. Next slide, please. Just a quick brief. So Mark discussed what can be counted as benefits and costs in your analysis. We've shared the software that you can use to calculate the BCA. Now we're going to talk about other variables that factor into the benefit cost ratio calculation. Next slide, please. All righty. Well, this slide shows some of the basic information that's needed. You're going to have a project title, and that can be whatever makes sense to you. The property location, and within the tool, it will allow you to enter an address or latitude and longitude. Again, Mark will cover that. And the property structure type, is it residential or commercial? But other information that's going to be entered is going to be dependent upon the type of hazard addressed, which you're going to enter, and then the project proposed. So these sorts of things include frequency and damage relationship, hazard data, your project useful life, or PUL, and the recurrence interval, how often this is going to happen. We anticipate it happening. Next slide, please. One of the first things you'll be asked to choose is how you'll enter the data related to the damages from the hazard that you're addressing and how often they occur. And you've got three choices. One, modeled damages. You'll use this if you have location-specific hazard information, such as a flood insurance study, or you're doing a hurricane wind, tornado, hurricane safe room, not really around here, sorry. Those aren't so great examples. Wildfire, seismic building mitigation, a drought. You can select this option to perform the analysis on the property regardless of past damage history. The BCA results for the selected hazard will be modeled or projected, another way of putting it, based on the inputs provided. The software is going to walk you through questions related to the number of buildings protected by the project, and so you'll have that information entered. Your second option is historical damages. So if you have insufficient data to use modeled damages, for instance, the flood or structure elevation data for the flood model, or you can use this if you have a damage history for the property. So you actually know that in X, Y, and Z years, these things happened, and you had and you have records of what it costs to repair. Third option, professional expected damages. So you're going to use this option if the hazard event hasn't occurred, or it may not have occurred, but not to the, it may have happened, but not to the extent that it could happen. So, but if the event were to occur at the level that you anticipate, you would be utilizing professional data that shows how much damage would be likely. So you would be using expected damages estimated by a qualified professional. An engineer was, that of course is the only example I can think of at this very moment. I just think of the engineers and how they are calculating the results of an impact. Now, if you have a project with both historical and professional expected damages, you can select historical damages. Projects that mitigate non-building historical and professional expected damages, we used to call them the DFA, the damage frequency assessment, in older versions of the toolkit. What else? Okay, what else I want to tell you? Oh, this is important. So the primary data for the primary data are these are historic damages and losses of the data, and losses and the dates of years for those events. So you've got to have at least one event of a known frequency, which means that you know the recurrence interval, and we'll talk about that. And there must be at least 3 events of unknown frequency if you don't know how often it's going to happen. That means that the user has only the dates and the damage amount, but you've got to have documentation for that. One thing I want to mention that I've noticed that a number of people forget is that you also need to be able to enter expected damages after mitigation. So we know that the project is to mitigate the future damages, but it's highly unlikely that you won't see some impact even after you've done the mitigation, but it'll be less. We really talked about the only way that you can never have a damage would be if you remove the property. So a demolition project where you've completely removed the property so you're no longer going to have flooding or something like that, that's an example of where you wouldn't really need to think about the expected damages after mitigation because they would be zero. Otherwise, you're going to need to consider them. Next slide, please. How long is that generator expected to last? Or how long can we expect the building that we retrofitted to stand? The PUL is important in the calculation of the benefit cost ratio because it establishes and I'm going to ask, am I cutting out?
Yes, Jane, you are just a little bit.
Is it still happening? I noticed that I was having an issue with my VPN as I was speaking. Is it better now, or am I still cutting?
It's better now. You're not cutting out at the moment. When you're here,
okay.
You're very clear, but every once in a while you've cut out for just a few seconds at a time.
I hope that those were the non-essential pieces that I had in my presentation.
Me too.
Hey, Jane,
okay.
If you can close out of anything else you have open, like Teams or anything, that tends to help.
Okay. Unfortunately, it was the only way that I knew that I was cutting out, but I'll close out of those things. All right. Thanks very much, Brenna. So we'll try it. I think that I was having a VPN issue at the time, but we'll try. So do let me know. Let's see. We were talking about the project useful life. So it establishes the time frame to calculate the benefits. If you have a very high cost and a very low project useful life, you're going to have a problem showing cost effectiveness. If you're paying $500,000 for something that's only going to last 2 years, that's an issue. So because higher PUL values extend the duration over which the benefits are calculated, and that means that you're raising your final benefit cost ratio. The project useful life is also used to calculate the total amount of project maintenance costs by applying them to each year of usefulness. So you don't have to include those maintenance costs in your application, but you do need to include them in your BCA, and it calculates them out and shows that in your total cost. So many project types use a standard value, for instance. And one of the great things about tools, the Toolkit 6.0, is that it has these things really nicely laid out for you. Defensible space is a great example. Defensible space for a wildfire, you're looking at something really short, 4 years. Ignition-resistant construction could be 10 years. And there are variations in the project useful life depending upon the details. And my favorite example is a culvert. If you've got a culvert with an end treatment, end sections or head walls or something, it has a project useful life of 30 years. While a culvert without end treatment is only a 10-year PUL. It might be a bit geekish, but I found that really interesting. And so as we're talking about what we're doing in our community, we can also be thinking about how long something is intended to last and how cost effective is it going to be. So those are some of the standard values, and you can use a higher number than the standard. But in order to do that, you've got to have a credible source, and you've got to provide documentation to back this up. For instance, a good source for non-standard values comes from that project engineer, those trustee engineers, or the manufacturer of the equipment that you plan on installing. Am I cutting out at all? I'm seeing some flashing on my screen.
You're coming in clear for me.
Thank you very much. So if you've got that material, the manufacturer of the equipment, you can ask them for some spec sheets. And if they're able to provide documentation, you have something that you can submit with your application. However, even with documentation, a PUL value can't be higher than the highest acceptable limits value that's in that PUL summary table. And again, it's within the toolkit, and it's a really good reference place. Next slide, please. Recurrence interval. The recurrence interval, or RI, you might see it show up, is how often a hazard event of a specific severity is likely to occur in a particular location. In this case, we talk not just about the frequency of a storm, but also how strong is the storm and what can we expect to happen because of it. As we relate this to some of the work that we do in our communities, we talk about, and you might hear talk about an event of that was a 100-year flood, or it had a 1% annual chance of a flood. So, and it's based on the probability that the given event will be equaled or exceeded in any given year. So that means on average that we can expect a flood of this size or greater to occur within a 100-year period. We can't predict that will occur in a particular year, only that each year has a 1 in 100 chance of having a flood of that magnitude. So it also doesn't mean that only one flood of that size can occur within 100 years, but that's where the probability lies. We can find this damage data in records of events, utility company reports. There's universities or other academic fields that track the patterns. Insurance reports are a great resource. Projects that mitigate more frequent events are more likely to be cost effective. And that's because of the benefits that are gained from not having the losses. So if you have more events happening, there's more chance for loss. Next slide, please. Mark shared with me this great example of a project, and we wanted to share it. And because it has some really good pieces into it. So one of the things we do in reviewing a project is we take the data as presented and we rerun the benefit cost analysis. Sometimes we come up with a different number if we find a bit of data that might not be ultimately eligible or it was misentered or something. But if after review the BCR still comes out over 1, it's cost effective. And at the bottom of this slide, you'll see that the sub-applicant submitted an aggregated BCR of 3.31, and that means that they had multiple items in there. And that's the overall BCR. So here's a bit of background on the fire station generators project and why it was so good. The project was funded to bring in emergency power generators at 2 fire stations in Eugene, Oregon. These fire stations were the only 2 in Eugene that did not have backup power generators, and they had been continually shut down over a period of years because ice storms caused power outages, and that I got to giggle a little bit, I'm sorry, but it prevented the station staff from opening the garage doors so that the station could respond to medical emergencies or the fire services in their service area. So obviously they needed backup power. So that was never in question, but was it going to be cost effective? Now they originally said that it was 3.31. In the post-review it was 2.63. Still really great. But why was it so good for us? It's obviously cost effective, so they've got that. But what made it such a good review for us? It was well documented. They had specific ice storm outage data for the stations on spreadsheets from the local electric utility. The fire department, before submitting, had studied backup power requirements, and they knew exactly what specifications and equipment were needed for the new generators, the fuel tank, the switches, and the other equipment that were going to be needed. No surprises. They knew what their total costs were going to be there. They had the documentation from the potential vendors on costs for the equipment and maintenance. And so this validated the project costs because they had documentation. They also had credible information from the National Weather Service, the forecast office on ice storms and storm recurrence intervals. They had credible information from the City of Eugene emergency manager on which to base those post-mitigation damages. And the project was cost effective. This was a great project and we were able to walk through it, and it was supported by the documentation that allowed us to go, yes, 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 great project, here's your award. Okay, that was a bit simplistic, but honestly, that's one of the ways that we're able to support the community with the work that we do. Mark, you're going to open up the BCA tool and walk us through some of the steps that you're going to take to get into it. And my computer has just informed me that it's about to reboot. So it's a good time to be handing this over to you. And I'm going to have to log out and rejoin you in just a few moments. So,
all right.
Okay, take it away, and I'll be back in just a little bit. Thanks.
Okay, Michelle, let me...
So you should be seeing that original screen now with the white, and it's a Share My Desktop.
Share My Desktop, all right.
Yep, so whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Okay, I think I'm monitor 1. Hang on here.
There we go.
There we go. Okay, so what I'm going to show you, I'm going to walk through the tool and show you the BCA for just one of those fire stations. Now they were, the BCAs were different. I don't have both of them in this file here, but one was a newer station, one was bigger, one had more personnel. So how even though the costs may have been very similar in terms of the generators and the installation, the benefit cost ratios were different based on the other components. So this is what the calculator looks like. And to open it up, you basically hit the button here on the upper right-hand corner. I've already done that. So now we'll just open the calculator and get into the actual analysis for one of the fire stations. So the calculator has sort of 2 different levels. This is the project level. And so you can have multiple projects in your BCA toolkit. But as you click on the project, now if this was both of the fire stations, you would see two titles and things in here, 2 files. So this is just for one of the structures. So I'll open it up and walk you through the BCA, but also show you some of the features of the benefit cost tool itself and where you can find things like project useful life and some other information that you can find that will be very helpful as you're developing your project. The help menus here are just amazing. So the benefit cost calculator has 2 pages. The first page, which is what we're on, has just basic information about the project, and I'll walk you through these here in just a moment. Also, if you look at the big blue bar, go to the far right-hand side, you'll see the little white dot with the I in it. That's gets you to the help menu. So, and the help menu that comes up really depends upon the section that you're in. So we'll just open it up here for project configuration. So this is, you can open or close any of these help items. And so I'll show you some of the features of it here in just a little bit. So here, this is geared toward the project configuration. So if you have questions about property location, or say you have the street address, or you just have the Latin long, what would the street address be? This tells you about how that's taken care of. It mentions a property location is important for specific project types because these are some of the modeled damage benefit cost analyses that are done. So it needs to have a very specific location because it uses hazard specific information for the calculations. When you go to close the help menu, do not click on the red X. That will exit you out of the benefit cost calculator. Choose to close, and it'll close the help menu here. So I'll get back into the help menu in a little bit here. So again, we have on the first page here, the first section, the project title, the address, and we're using the property location for the address. You can say no, and it'll determine what you plug in the Latin long, and then it'll find the address, but we're doing it this way. You will need to enter the zip code, the state, and the county where it's in, or if you're in Alaska, the borough or the census area. So the next selection is what's your building type? And these are your selections. It's a residential, non-residential, critical facility, a utility, road, bridge, or an other. And so we're selecting critical facility because we have a fire station. Oh, no, here. I can't make any change that I make on this page. I'll just warn you as you get into this. Any change I make here basically blank, it changes everything to 0 on page 2. So I need to be careful here that I don't get too crazy and blast out my BCA before I show it. So the hazard type. So for critical facilities, you pretty much have every type of hazard that you can pick from. So for generators, the hazard is infrastructure failure. Now, it may have been caused by an ice storm. Power outages are the reason you want your generator. So, there's no way to figure out the power outage here, so we consider that infrastructure failure. So that's what you need for generators. And mitigation type other. So depending upon the hazard type, it will give you some choices in terms of the mitigation action you're taking. For here, it's an other, it's not listed, so you just pick other. So down at the bottom here, damage and frequency relationship. It's based on, now you see model damages is blanked out. You can't select that. For only certain hazards and property types can you use model damages. Now I will say that when you're using the benefit cost tool here, you need to be connected to the internet. And the reason is, it will pull in site-specific hazard information for those analyses you're doing with modeled damages. So the tool won't work well, or perhaps at all, depending upon your hazard and mitigation action type. If you are, you're not connected to the internet, it may not function. But for here, we're using historical damages because, again, they've got documented data on power outages, and we'll talk about that in a little bit here. So cost estimation, again, here's where you enter the project useful years. And so I'm sure you're going to question, well, how'd you come up with 19 years? So that's for the most part, it's a FEMA standard value, so you click on your help button. And so here you see project useful life, and you'll see a large table, and we'll show you where generators are here in a second. But on the left-hand side, you have project types, and then you'll see useful life down the center. So the standard value for any of these projects, if you pull the standard value here, so for example, Jay mentioned a culvert. If it's got an end treatment, it's 30 years. You plug in the 30 years in your BCA, and you don't have to explain it. However, if you're using, you want to use 50 years, then you'll have to provide some documentation to support that. All right. So again, these are the upper and lower bounds of acceptable limits for useful life alongside there. So we'll just sort of scroll down and see if we can find our emergency generator here. So here we are, generators, 19 years, with the note that you can change that based on manufacturer's warranty or other documentation that demonstrates that your generator life is longer than 19 years. So for example, if you get documentation and that says it's 30 years, then you can use 30 years, for example. Okay, we'll close that. So here's the initial project cost. So this is basically the dollar amount from the budget that's in the application for this building, for this particular fire station. And annual maintenance costs are $1,500 a year. And so the total project cost has, for benefit cost calculation purposes, is $90,438. One other thing that I will two things here I'll show you on the page before we go. Anything that's shaded out, any entry field that's shaded out means it's populated by the BCA tool. And so it's only the white items that you see as you scroll over them, they sort of light up here where you can do data entry. The other thing I want to show you is these little hash marks on the far right side. This is where you can add comments. And we love comments. I mean, if you add comments in terms of, so if you want to tell me where this cost figure came from, you can write a comment in here that says the initial project cost comes from the project budget for structure number 1, see application page 25, or whatever the citation might be. And then you can save that, and then you can, if you put comments in your BCA tool, it really helps the reviewer understand what your data input is, or where it came from. Okay, so we go to page 2. So you'll need to know the year the analysis was conducted. So let's say we've just are doing that this year for a project. So we put in the current year. This project actually was funded a couple of years ago. So the analysis year would have been, I think, 2018 is what we had, 2018 or 2019. The property, the year the property was built, 2005, so that's important to know. So the tool will do the analysis over a 17-year period. Okay, so here's where we get into the properties of the critical facility. So we can choose from fire station, hospital, police station, and there's also an other category. All right, so if you have a facility that your community considers as critical, whether it's the warehouse I spoke of earlier that had some critical refrigerated materials in there that were critical to the community or the healthcare system or whatever, we'll still count those as critical facilities. So you've got another choice, and if you describe your facility in a way that it's a critical facility, then we will not, take a difference with that. So you'll need to know for critical facilities how many people are served. So for the fire station here, so this has 15,000 people that it serves, and you'll have to get this information documented from the fire department, and that did come in with the application. So you need to know what the setting is. Is it an urban, suburban, rural, or wilderness area? And you'll need to know whether the station provides emergency medical services. That's a pretty easy yes or no answer. And then you need to know what's the distance between this fire station and the nearest one that would provide emergency medical services in that area. So that's, again, 3.4 miles. And so the tool uses this data to calculate the value of service that this fire station provides on a daily basis to the community of Eugene at $41,279. Okay, so when the power is out, that impacts the ability for the fire station to provide service. So this is how we can figure out the values here. And so we'll go to the next area here. So they've chosen to use historic damage before mitigation. One thing Jane mentioned earlier, and she was cutting out a little bit during this, but in terms of events that you can use damage events before mitigation, you can use one damage event as long as you know the recurrence interval. But if you do not know the recurrence interval, you'll need at least 3 damage events. And so what we have here is 3 damage events. And so what we're looking at here is impact days, okay? So the first damage event here occurred in 2012. It shut down the fire station for 2.3 days. Now we know how many days, hours, and minutes based on the utility information, and so we just have to put that into a decimal. So again, the first event's about 2 1/3 days. The second event's 4 1/2 days. The last event is more than 9 days, and so the tool then will calculate based on the value of daily damage. It'll calculate damages from your event, and so because these damages occurred in the past, we can inflate the dollar value to current dollars, and so we chose not to do that at this point, but this is a way you can do that, and it's especially important if your damages are 20, 30 years old, and so you can inflate them to current dollars. But because our analysis is this year, there's no need to do that. And so we come up with an annualized benefit here. And basically what this does is provides us with sort of an annual average, knowing that, we don't have hazard events that occur of the same magnitude every year, right? So this sort of smooths out the highs and the lows and provides us with an annual. And so the annualized damage here is $43,000. Oh, also, you can see based on the period that we're doing the analysis, it has calculated recurrence intervals for these different events. So basically, the first event, it's saying, well, this happens on average every 6 years. The next level event about every 9 years, and then the largest one about every 18 years, okay? So expected damages after mitigation, this is pretty much, and there's a narrative that was presented from the Eugene emergency manager, but this basically is based on a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. And the impact today being 1, and basically that 1 came from the fact that it would take at least that long for someone to come out and service the generator if it was knocked offline. And so the tool here basically calculates the benefits, the costs, and comes up with a benefit cost ratio. So basically, one of the early slides, remember we had benefits over costs. And so this is just basically what it looks like mathematically. So for this generator, this fire station, this project, the benefit cost ratio is 4.93. So you'll also see, you see entries here, it says total standard mitigation benefits, total mitigation project benefits. So you might see a different number under total mitigation project benefits if you can capture social benefits. This is primarily limited to mitigation projects on residential structures where you have human impacts. For example, there's loss of income, there's stress that comes about from the disaster. You can capture those benefits, and again, those are pre-calculated, or the software calculates those benefits based on how many people live in the structure and then how many work. There's also something for some of the project types that have some impact to the environment. You can calculate ecosystem benefits. And so basically, you can capture benefits of your project on various ecosystems, whether it's open space, riparian, and that sort of thing. So we don't have those in this project, so that's why you see the total project benefits equaling the standard mitigation benefits. And again, I don't see any comments in here. So this is what the tool looks like. So it'll look the same. We used historic benefits. It'll look the same if we choose professional expected benefits. The look on page 2 will be a little different when we're doing model damages, or if there's other benefits that this project type does not capture. For example, human casualties. That's only on certain project types, and so if you're doing it for like a seismic structural retrofit, that will pop up, and you'll need some information on people who are in the building at any one time, and so forth. So that's a very quick tour of our benefit cost tool. So you'll only get entries. You're only going to be required to enter data that's specific to that project type. It won't ask you for data that it doesn't need for your project. So for those other things that I mentioned, you don't have to worry about those until they show up on your screen. You can also generate a report. So we'll just view the report here. So what is nice is that this is tied to Google Maps, and so you can actually show where your project is, and this is where our fire station is located. So our report basically provides the information that we've input and puts it into a report form. And so you will need to include a copy of this report as well as an export file. So I'll go home here. So here's where you can export your project, and you would want to save it as a zip file and include that in your project. And if I'm wrong in that, Brenna or Ravi, please correct me. All right.
No, that's correct, Mark. You definitely want to make sure you're including that in your application.
Okay, so I'm done with the screen share. So Michelle, if you could get me back to the
All right, I'm going to steal
presentation
the from you.
Yes, steal it back.
Right here. Okay. You guys
All right. Next slide, please. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about cost effectiveness and documentation, and we've already talked about documentation. And it's very important to include documentation to support the data that you input. You just can't submit one with no documentation. What will happen as at the National Technical Review, if you can't support a data entry point at the review, they'll turn it to 0. So you can just imagine that you can't change too many data inputs to 0 and have a positive benefit, outcome for your BCA. So back to the presentation. So how do you know if your project's cost effective? Well, the tool will give you a benefit cost ratio. As you saw with the fire station, it was what, 4.93, something of that magnitude. But we really, all you need to do is provide a benefit cost ratio that's at least 1. Now you might want to make it as a little higher than that for the national competition, but because you'd like to account for all the benefits that you have. So again, as we mentioned, you want to include a copy of the exported BCA as well as a copy of the BCA report. Okay, next slide, please. So if you were expecting a ratio greater than 1, there are things, and it doesn't come out that way, there are things you can do to try to increase that. Now, before I get started in talking about this, is you are allowed to use the methodology that gets you the best benefit cost ratio. So for example, if using historic damage doesn't work, you know, and if you can use model benefits or model damages based on the project type, you know, do that. Or, you know, use a professional expected damages. So, but you, again, you'll need to have documentation to support whichever methodology that you use. So things you can do to try to increase your benefit cost ratio number is make sure that all your inputs are correct. All it takes is transposition of a couple of numbers to cause your benefit cost ratio to sink below 1.0. This happened to a project several years ago when I was with the state of Washington, where the benefit cost analysis was the last thing put together in the application. It wasn't checked well, it was submitted. Well, it did not get funded. It was a great project, very well documented, but nobody checked the data entry. The benefit cost ratio was below 1, and so it was not selected for further review. So the community was sort of astounded by that, but they went back and looked, found their error, and submitted it the next year, and the project was selected for review. So, number one thing, check, double check, triple check, check 4 times, have multiple people make sure that your data is correct. All right. Make sure that you have the correct project and structure data. For example, for buildings that you want to say elevate, you need to make sure that you know the type of basement, the number of residents, the project costs, and so forth. As I mentioned before, you can run your BCA using a different frequency and damage relationship, whether it's, you know, model damages if it's allowed, historic, or professionally expected. Use a different combination of structures. So for example, if you want to elevate 6 homes in a cul-de-sac, and maybe you've got a couple buildings that are below, have a benefit cost ratio that's low enough that it drags down the whole project, maybe leave one of those out of the project and see if that improves the benefit cost ratio, for example. You can combine benefits from different hazards. So for example, if you have historic damages, if you're doing a structure retrofit and it's been damaged by flood and earthquake, you can include benefits from both of those hazards and so forth, and put them in the benefit cost analysis. Again, the tool will prompt you if you can add environmental benefits or social benefits. And the last thing, it says look for better data sources. Yeah, use the best data that you can find when you're providing, if you're pulling data out of a study or, flood insurance study or, an engineering study, for example, and it's 1,000 pages, please don't attach to your application a 1,000-page report and say, I found my information here. Please just give us the copy of the title page and the 3 or 4 pages that really tell us what we need to know. So, next slide, please. All right, we've been talking about documentation. Yes, and attach all your source documentation. And if you make any changes, make sure you document that. Again, a good place to put some of your information to explanatory information is in the comment section. Please do that. If you change any of the automatic values, you have to tell us why in the toolkit and refer to the documentation that you're using. All right. Your data should be from credible and reliable sources. There is a lot of information available to you that's online. For example, if you're looking for information on storm events from your community from 20, 30 years ago, it's most likely online in a National Weather Service report of some kind. The National Climatic Data Center, which is part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has great reports on severe weather events from every month for every year for quite some time. You can pull information out there, and you can use that information to help determine recurrence intervals, for example. So again, you use engineering documents, studies, flood maps, etc. Just make sure that it is from a credible source. Next slide, please. All right, here's another example of a project that unfortunately did not get funded in the after the National Technical Review from a past, I think this is a bold pre-disaster mitigation project. So the project was to replace a 24-inch diameter culvert with a 96-inch culvert designed to meet the State Department of Transportation standards and so forth. Some of the information that they needed was on permitting, easements, engineering and technical service and so forth. The project cost was $1.3 million. Annual maintenance cost was $5,000. So the submitted benefit cost analysis, the BCR, the benefit cost ratio is 1.56. And after going through the National Technical Review several years ago, when the project was submitted, again, they rerun the benefit cost analysis with the documentation that's provided, and it went down to 0.59. Why? It didn't have sufficient documentation for the data that's provided in the benefit cost analysis. Next, please. Knowledge check. All right. Which of the following projects is not likely to be cost effective? So spend a few moments there. Your mic is on, Brenna.
We'll give everybody just one more second here. Not everyone has had a chance to weigh in.
Great, Michelle. Thank you.
No problem. And it looks like most everyone is selecting C for this one.
Selecting C. That would be correct. So let's go through them. Project that costs $1 million and protects a wastewater treatment plant serving a large population. So an analysis using wastewater treatment plant, we're going to be asking for the same kinds of some of the same kinds of information that we asked on the fire station, and that is, how many people does it serve? There's a FEMA standard value on the daily value of service, and I don't recall what that is off the top of my head. So, any project that will protect a wide range of structures or people tend to be cost effective. So tornado safe room in an area with a high tornado risk, yes. Project that costs $1 million and protects a large hospital, most likely. One that protects 3 vacation homes, it may be, but not as likely as the other ones. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, some reminders here. It's important to remember that the toolkit is a calculator. It does not validate your data. So it just uses the numbers that you put in to do the calculations. So if you give it a bad number, you won't get an accurate calculation and an accurate benefit cost ratio. So again, as I mentioned, double check, triple check, 4 times check your entries for accuracy and also reasonableness, and use the data that you've got documentation for. All right, next slide, please. Okay, here's a few resources that you can tap into. Next slide, please. We have FEMA Go. So you've heard in previous presentations that we've done in our webinar series that FEMA Go is the electronic platform that's used for applying for funding under the BRIC program and also the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. So there's a link to FEMA Go and a phone number and email address that you can use if you need assistance with registering to get access to the tool. Next slide, please. Some additional resources that you can use for the notice of funding opportunity, various webinars, and I believe this is a link to the webinars that were done at a national level that were, we covered somewhat of the same information as the national webinars, but they also did, they looked at a little different level than we are, but you can go back and review those. Make sure that you have downloaded a copy of our Hazard Mitigation Assistance Guidance. That provides a great deal of help as you're walking through the application process. It helps you determine what's eligible for funding, what's not eligible for funding, provides all sorts of information to help you put together your applications and how to administer the grants and implement your projects afterwards. And again, the BCA website also has resources including curriculum for the benefit cost analysis classes that we teach. And again, you can access all of the webinars that we have completed this year, and there's a link to that down below. We've recorded all of these projects. I'll give out one more shout out to the BCA helpline. and Jane provided the information a little bit earlier in terms of how to contact them. My advice to you is to make your inquiries in writing, because they will write you back, and you can use their assistance if they steer you in a direction in terms, if you ask a question on, you know, a data source or what sort of data to include, you can use the response that they provide you as documentation for your BCA if that's necessary. So anything that you put in writing, they will give you a written response back, and you can attach that. Next slide, please. Okay, again, here's our schedule. We showed it earlier. We've got a couple left next week at the same time. We'll have FEMA Go Introduction and Basics. And then the last webinar in our session, our season here of applications for BRIC and FMA is FEMA Grants Management, and so there's the date and time for that one also. Next slide, please. So here's your non-disaster grant team, and I think they've all been hanging out, or most of them been hanging out today. So we have Rob McCullough, Cindy Palmer, Brenda Medicini, Carla Keelan, and Ravi Dutta, and you've heard a couple of the voices online here today. So these are the folks from the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Branch that are your, you can contact directly for assistance with your applications. Any questions you might have about the grant programs and so forth. And next slide, please. And here's also folks from our Tribal Affairs team that we work with hand in glove. They're with our External Affairs branch. And the folks here are Jay LaPlante, Aurora Lair, Erin Ward, and Ramona Van Cleve. Now, Ramona is in Alaska. She works with the Alaska tribes and native villages, and you'll want to grab her before the end of the year if you need any sort of assistance or not sure who to contact. You know, you can contact any of these folks, and they'll be glad to help you with connections back to some of the grant staff or other folks that you might need assistance from. Next, please.
I think that's all we have for today.
That is all we have today.
I do have a closing poll if you would like me to send that out about this experience today.
Certainly. Please do that.
Sure. And there was one question being answered in the Q&A. I didn't know if you had seen that one.
Hey, Mark, I'll answer this question actually verbally. Cynthia, it really depends. So for the scenario you give for relocation and potentially having a conflict for duplication of benefits, it really depends. So if you are applying specifically for like a larger relocation, you'd want to make sure you're including all of the funding sources. But if there's multiple projects within that holistic relocation and FEMA's just paying for a portion of it, let's say relocating some homes, then the benefit cost analysis could be done with just that cost. So we might need a little bit more information depending on what that answer is. Go ahead and shoot us an email, Cynthia, and we can certainly get you more information based on that.
Well, I think that's it from us. This has been a great opportunity. I'm so pleased that we've had that we've been able to share some information with you on the benefit cost analysis. On behalf of Mark and I want to say thank you, and your team is ready and willing to answer any questions that they can, feel free to send them an email, as Mark was saying, or reach out directly to your tribal affairs team. So thank you very much. Michelle, do we need to do anything other than just say thank you again and drop?
That's all, Jane. Whenever
all right. Thank you very much for
the session. I'll hold it open if there are any questions that come through.
Thank you for your great hosting. Appreciate it.
Of course. It looks like maybe that's all for today, folks, so I'm going to go ahead and close out the session unless anyone needs to stay for any reason.
Thanks again, Michelle.
Yes, thank you.